They say the war ends when the guns fall silent. But some wounds don't bleed, they just bury themselves deep and wait. Out here, on the edge of nowhere, where the wind howls like it's remembering every name lost to gunpowder and fire, a scarred woman kept to herself, stitching bones and watching people leave. Then, one night, the door blew open. A half-dead man fell across her floor. Dirty uniform, fevered eyes. A wanted poster folded in his coat pocket. He was supposed to be her enemy. She was supposed to turn him in. But winter doesn't care for rules, and neither does mercy. This is a story about scars that don't show, debts that can't be paid, and a kind of love forged in silence and storm. Not everyone will survive, but some might finally be seen. What would you have done in her place? What does forgiveness cost when you're the one who needs it most? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and let's see how it all unfolds. The wind, a bitter, lonely thing, had been clawing at the clapboard walls of Clara Barton's small infirmary for 3 days straight. Out here on the Dakota frontier, winter didn't so much arrive as lay siege. And this year, it had come early and with a vengeance. Clara, a woman whose own seasons had seen more than their share of harsh weather, stoked the potbelly stove. The orange glow, a small defiance against the encroaching dusk and the endless white outside. She carried her past like a well-worn saddlebag, heavy but familiar. The war was years gone, but its echoes still rattled in the quiet moments. They lived in the slight tremor of her hands as she measured out dried herbs, in the way her gaze would sometimes fix on the middle distance, seeing battlefields where others saw only prairie. And they lived, most visibly, in the scar. A puckered, silvered line traced a path from the high curve of her cheekbone down towards the corner of her mouth. A permanent map of a moment when the world had exploded in a flurry of shrapnel and screams. Some folks in the settlement, what little there was of it, whispered, "It was a rebel bullet." Clara never corrected them, let them think what they would. The truth was her own. Her infirmary wasn't much, just a sturdy log structure with a lean-to for supplies, smelling of dried herbs, carbolic, and the faint, ever-present scent of wood smoke. It was a place for the forgotten, the overlooked, a trapper with a festering wound, a homesteader's child consumed by fever, an old prospector whose cough rattled like stones in a tin can. She'd come west seeking, well, she wasn't entirely sure what. Peace, perhaps, or maybe just a place where the ghosts of Antietam and Fredericksburg wouldn't crowd her so. Here, at least, the work was straightforward, a quiet mending of bodies, if not souls. The meager daylight had all but surrendered when the sound tore through the howl of the wind. A desperate, frantic hammering on her stout oak door, not the polite rap of a neighbor, but the fist of someone at the very end of their rope. Clara paused, her hand hovering over a mortar and pestle. Company was rare. Company in a storm like this, unheard of. She reached for the old Colt peacemaker she kept on a high shelf. A precaution, nothing more. Holding it loosely by her side, she called out, her voice steady. "Who's there?" A ragged cough answered, followed by a man's voice, rough and strained. "Help! Please! Need help!" She unlatched the door, pushing it open just enough to peer out. The wind snatched at her breath, flinging icy crystals into her face. A figure huddled there, bulked against the storm, snow clinging to a threadbare greatcoat that, even in the dim light, she recognized. Faded blue, Union blue. Her heart gave a strange, unwelcome lurch. He swayed, one hand pressed to his side, the other clutching the doorframe as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. "Ma'am, I'm real sick." Clara's eyes, accustomed to assessing wounds in the harshest conditions, took him in quickly. The feverish glint in his eyes, the pallor beneath the grime and stubble, the way he shivered uncontrollably despite the heavy coat. He was more than sick. He was knocking on death's door. "Get inside," she said. Her voice clipped. "All nurse now." She stepped back, the Colt still in her hand, though lowered. There was something about the slump of his shoulders, the sheer exhaustion radiating from him, that eased her immediate suspicion. A threat. He was not now. Anyway, he stumbled over the threshold, nearly collapsing. She caught him, surprised by the dead weight of him, guiding him towards the narrow cot she kept for patients. "Easy now." As he sank onto the cot, his head lulled back, and the flickering lamplight caught the details of his uniform more clearly. Old? Yes. Worn? Certainly. But official issue? No doubt about it. A sergeant's chevrons, barely visible beneath a layer of grime. The war had been over for years. What was a Union sergeant, still in uniform, doing wandering the Dakota Territory in the dead of winter, wounded and alone? Deserter, her mind whispered, or worse. But then he coughed, a racking, painful sound that shook his whole frame, and a fleck of blood appeared at the corner of his lips. The nurse in Clara silenced the cynic. Conscience, she'd learned long ago, was a heavier burden than any suspicion. "Let's get this coat off you," she said, her tone softening slightly. She set the Colt on her small workbench, within reach but not overtly threatening. His fingers fumbled with the buttons, too weak and shaky. Gently, she pushed his hands away. "Allow me." The wool was damp, stiff with cold. Beneath it, his shirt was soaked, partly with sweat, partly with something darker seeping from a crude bandage on his left side, just above the hip. "You've been shot." It wasn't a question. His eyes, glazed with fever, tried to focus on her. "Ambush. Couple of days back. Thought I could make it to a settlement." "You found one," she said, already reaching for her shears. "Barely." She worked with an efficiency honed by countless nights like this, though usually under canvas, with the roar of cannons for a soundtrack, water heated on the stove, cloths, antiseptic. She made herself from yarrow and willow bark as she cleaned the wound. Ugly, inflamed, but not yet gangrenous. He drifted in and out of consciousness. "The name's Ben," he muttered once, his voice thick. "Ben Bishop." "Clara," she replied, not looking up from her task. "Rest now." "Ben Bishop, you're burning with fever." She got a strong broth down him, laced with willow bark for the fever and pain. He was too weak to fight her, too far gone to question. She covered him with thick wool blankets, the best she had. The storm raged on outside, but inside the small cabin, a fragile truce held. Hours passed. Clara sat by the stove, mending a tear in one of her own aprons, the rhythmic pull of needle and thread a familiar comfort. She watched him. This stranger the storm had delivered to her door. His breathing was shallow, ragged. Occasionally, he'd cry out, a muffled sound, thrashing beneath the blankets. It was in one of these fevered episodes that the words tumbled out, disjointed. "Chilling? No. The children. Didn't see. A massacre." His voice was a hoarse whisper, laced with an agony that had nothing to do with his physical wound. Flames. So much. Smoke. They didn't stand a chance. Clara froze, her needle halfway through a stitch. She looked at the man on the cot, his face contorted in some remembered horror. Massacre. Her mind, already wary, sharpened. This wasn't the talk of a common soldier caught in a skirmish. This wasn't about a fair fight. If any fight could be called fair, this hinted at something darker, something that stained the soul. She rose slowly and walked to the small, frost-laced window, peering out into the swirling blackness. The wind shrieked like a banshee. Ben Bishop, ex-Union sergeant, was more than just a wounded man seeking shelter. He carried a story within him, one that seemed as raw and infected as the bullet wound in his side. And she, Clara Barton, who had sought refuge from the war's brutality, now found it knocking on her door in the guise of a fevered, delirious man. A chill deeper than the winter night settled in Clara's bones. The scar on her cheek throbbed, an old ache for new troubles. Whatever peace she had found in this isolated corner of the world felt suddenly precariously fragile. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and glittering under a pale, watery sun. Inside the infirmary, Ben Bishop surfaced from the depths of fever like a man clawing his way out of a deep, dark well. His first coherent thought was of the woman, Clara. He remembered her name, her steady hands, the scar that seemed to catch the lamplight as if it held a story all its own. His second thought was of the faded blue uniform he still wore, a flag of his past that could just as easily become his shroud. He braced himself for the inevitable, a woman alone on the frontier, finding a man like him, wounded, likely a deserter in the eyes of many, had choices. She could turn him over to the nearest fort, if there was one, for whatever small reward or civic duty dictated, or she could simply turn him out, back into the unforgiving wilderness. When Clara approached, her face was composed, unreadable. She checked his wound with a practiced touch, changed the dressing, and offered him a tin cup of weak, bitter tea. There was no accusation in her eyes, but no particular warmth either, just a cool, professional distance that was, in its own way, more unsettling than outright hostility. "Fever's down," she stated, her voice low and even. "The wound's clean for now. You were lucky." Ben swallowed, the tea scalding his raw throat. "Much obliged, ma'am." He watched her as she moved about the small cabin, tidying, her movements economical and precise. She didn't press him for answers, didn't ask about the uniform or how he'd come to be shot. This quiet forbearance was a currency he hadn't expected. As days bled into a week, a fragile rhythm established itself. Ben, still weak but mending, began to chafe under the forced idleness. He was a man used to work, to purpose. One morning, finding the woodbox near empty, he took Clara's axe, after a moment's hesitation, where he met her watchful eye and received a slow, almost imperceptible nod, and began to split the logs piled against the infirmary's outer wall. The sharp crack of wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe, felt good, solid. He worked slowly, careful not to strain his side, acutely aware of the vast, silent landscape around him and the precariousness of his sanctuary. He hauled water from the well, kept the fire fed, his movements quiet, unobtrusive, trying to make himself useful, less of a burden, always conscious of the need to remain unseen by anyone who might pass by the lonely settlement. They spoke little, mostly of necessities. "Water's getting low. Need more bandages." Yet, in the shared silences of long evenings, with the wind whispering secrets at the eaves and the stove humming its warmth, something began to shift, like ice slowly giving way to an underground spring. One evening, as Clara darned a thick wool sock, her needle moving with a hypnotic rhythm, she spoke, her voice softer than he'd yet heard it. "There was a boy," she said, her gaze distant, fixed on the dancing flames in the stove. "Young drummer boy. Couldn't have been more than 15. Virginia. So much blood. I tried. Lord knows I tried. But some wounds, they're too deep. You can pour everything you have into them, and still, they take." Ben stopped whittling the piece of kindling in his hands. He recognized the cadence of her words, the quiet sorrow that time hadn't managed to dull. It was the language of loss, a dialect he knew too well. He said nothing for a long while, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and Clara's gentle sigh. Then, slowly, As if dredging the words from a place of profound pain, he found himself speaking. Orders. He began, his voice raspy. Sometimes the orders are the things that kill you, even if you don't follow 'em. He paused, testing the air, testing her. She didn't look up, but her hands stilled in her lap. There was a village. They said it harbored hostiles. But when we got there, just old folks, women, children. The captain, he ordered us to. Ben's voice broke. He couldn't say the word. I couldn't. Me and a few others. We refused. It didn't stop it. Just made us outcasts. Clara finally lifted her eyes to his. The lamplight carved shadows on his face, revealing the raw anguish there. She saw it then, clear as the scar on her own cheek. The invisible wound, the festering guilt of a man forced to witness and to choose in the face of unspeakable horror. It wasn't the mark of a common deserter she saw, but the brand of a soul tormented by its own conscience. Her own ghosts stirred in recognition. The battlefield had many casualties, not all of them buried in the earth. The quiet understanding that passed between them in that moment was more profound than any absolution. Doubt hadn't vanished, but it had begun a slow, hesitant retreat. A few days later, another knock came at the door. This one light, almost timid. Clara opened it to find a small, tow-headed boy, no more than 8, bundled in clothes that were clean but patched. His name was Billy, an orphan she'd nursed through a bad bout of lung fever the previous spring, before a childless couple from a slightly larger settlement 2 days' ride away had taken him in. Miss Clara, he piped, his blue eyes wide. The Hendersons. They said I could come see if you needed help. They're headin' further west, said I. I could stay a bit, if you'd have me. His lower lip trembled. Clara's expression softened in a way Ben hadn't seen. Well, now, Billy, she said, her voice imbued with a sudden warmth. Look at you, all grown up. Come in out of that cold. Billy's arrival changed the atmosphere in the small cabin. His innocent chatter, his unquestioning acceptance of Ben, who he simply called Mr. Ben, and seemed to regard as just another patient, began to knit the three of them into an unlikely, temporary tapestry of something resembling a family. Ben found himself showing the boy how to set a simple snare, his hands, surprisingly gentle, guiding Billy's smaller ones. Clara taught Billy his letters by the firelight, her patient voice a counterpoint to the ever-present wind. But the frontier was a place of long ears and wagging tongues. Word, like tumbleweed, had a way of traveling. Whispers began to circulate in the tiny cluster of cabins and the lone general store that formed the nucleus of the settlement. Clara Barton's harboring a man, then, more pointedly, a soldier. Looks like a deserter. One afternoon, when Clara went to the store for flour and salt, Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, a woman whose baby Clara had delivered through a difficult birth, was cooler than usual. A few of the other women present fell silent when Clara entered, their eyes lingering on her with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. No one said anything outright, not yet, but the air was thick with it. Later that day, however, old Jedediah, a trapper whose leg Clara had set the year before, stopped by the infirmary. He didn't come in, just leaned against the doorframe, a brace of rabbits in his hand. Figured you could use these. Clara, he said, his gaze flicking briefly towards where Ben was splitting wood, then back to her. Winter's hard on everyone. He gave a curt nod and was gone, leaving the offering and a silent message of support that spoke volumes. Clara stood in the doorway, the cold air on her face, the weight of the rabbits in her hand. The community was drawing its lines. Some would condemn, spurred by fear or a rigid sense of wartime loyalty that refused to die. Others, touched by her past kindnesses or possessing a deeper understanding of the complexities of survival, might offer a quieter form of allegiance. The thaw of doubt within her own heart regarding Ben was one thing. The judgment of the world outside her door was another storm gathering on the horizon. The uneasy quiet that had settled over the small infirmary following Jedediah's gesture was heavier than any storm. It was the silence of a coming confrontation, a knowledge that the fragile peace Clara had cultivated was about to be tested. Ben felt it in the way Clara's gaze would sometimes linger on the door, a flicker of apprehension in her usually steady eyes. He felt it in himself, a low thrum of anxiety that even the rhythmic work of chopping wood couldn't fully dispel. One afternoon, seeking a spare strip of linen for a new bandage, Ben's hand brushed against a small, locked iron box tucked away on a high shelf in Clara's modest supply cupboard. It was out of place amongst the neatly labeled jars of herbs and rolls of cloth. Curiosity, a rare indulgence, got the better of him. He found the tiny key later, hanging on a nail behind a faded sampler that read, "Charity never faileth." Inside the box, nestled on a bed of yellowed cotton, lay a single, tarnished medal, a military decoration for nursing. Its ribbon frayed. He picked it up, the medal cool against his palm. It spoke of courage, of service recognized. Clara entered silently, finding him with the medal in his hand. Her face, usually so composed, tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's a relic from another life," she said, her voice carefully neutral. But he heard the undertone, the faint echo of pain. "You earned this," Ben stated quietly, holding it out to her. "For bravery." "I reckon." She didn't take it. Bravery. A humorless little smile touched her lips, not quite reaching her eyes, or the scar beside them, or for simply being too stubborn to quit when any sane person would have run. There's a fine line, Mr. Bishop, and some days, I'm not sure which side of it I was on. She took the medal, her fingers closing around it briefly before placing it back in the box and locking it away, as if entombing a part of herself. Some commendations feel more like accusations. The exchange left a profound impression on Ben. This woman, so self-possessed, so capable, carried her own deep well of doubt, a feeling he knew intimately. A few evenings later, the tables turned. Ben had fallen into an exhausted sleep after helping shore up a section of the lean-to roof damaged by the earlier storm. Little Billy was asleep on his pallet near the stove. Clara, mending one of Ben's torn shirts by the lamplight, noticed a small, worn leather-bound notebook peeking from the pocket of his discarded coat. It wasn't a conscious decision to pry. Her hand simply reached for it. Drawn by an instinct she didn't examine too closely. She opened it. The first few pages were mundane observations, notes on terrain, weather. But then, the entries changed. Names, just names, written in a surprisingly neat hand, followed by dates and sometimes a single, stark word: fever, ambush, river crossing. It was a litany of loss, a roster of souls he had known, men he had likely fought beside, men he hadn't been able to save. The list was long, achingly so. Clara's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't the journal of a hardened deserter. It was a ledger of grief, each name a testament to a burden he carried, an invisible counterpart to her own memories of the drummer boy and countless others. She closed the book gently, a wave of understanding, sharp and unexpectedly fierce, washing over her. His scars weren't all on the surface, just like hers. The fragile domesticity of their unusual household was shattered 2 days later by the unmistakable jingle of harness and the thud of shod hooves. Billy, playing near the window, cried out, "Soldiers! Miss Clara! Lots of 'em!" Clara's heart plummeted. She moved to the door, Ben a tense shadow behind her. A patrol of 6 Union cavalrymen, their blue uniforms stark against the muted landscape, had reined in before her infirmary. At their head was an officer, his face hard-bitten, his eyes missing nothing. Captain Marcus Thorne. Ben stiffened beside her. A low sound, almost a growl, escaping his lips. Thorne, he breathed. The name a curse. Captain Thorne dismounted, his gaze sweeping over Clara, then fixing on Ben with cold recognition. Well, Sergeant Ben Bishop. We've been looking for you for a long time. His eyes flicked to the infirmary, then back to Ben. Thought you'd run further than this, or perhaps you found yourself a sympathetic nurse. Clara stepped forward slightly, placing herself partially in front of Ben. Captain, she said, her voice calm despite the tremor in her hands. This man was brought to me near death. I am a nurse. I treat those in need. He's a deserter, ma'am, Thorne said flatly, and involved in matters far graver than simply abandoning his post. He's coming with us. Before Clara could respond, a frantic homesteader, a man named Peterson, whose wife Clara had recently treated for influenzas, galloped up, his face pale with fear. Captain, Miss Barton, there's riders. A rough bunch. Ex-soldiers by the look of 'em. They hit Miller's farm, took his stock, cleaned him out of supplies. They're headed this way. Reckon they'll be looking for medicines, food, anything they can get their hands on. Thorne swore under his breath. Damnation. Renegades. We heard rumors they were in the territory. He looked from Peterson to Clara's small, vulnerable infirmary, then to Ben, his expression unreadable. Seems we have more pressing concerns than one runaway sergeant. For the moment, the news threw Clara into a maelstrom of internal conflict. The renegades were a direct threat to her, to Billy, to the little she had built. Handing Ben over to Thorne might appease the military, perhaps even gain their protection. But then she saw Ben's face, grim and resigned, yet with a flicker of defiance in his eyes as he looked at his former captain. She remembered the names in his journal, the anguish in his voice when he spoke of the village. Could she condemn a man who had chosen conscience over orders, even if it made him an outlaw? Was his life less valuable than her own precarious safety, as if the heavens themselves sought to heighten the drama? Little Billy began to cough, a dry, rasping sound. By nightfall, he was burning with fever. The same lung ailment he'd suffered before had returned, fierce and relentless. The immediate threat of the renegades and the official menace of Captain Thorne's patrol faded into the background, overshadowed by the small, struggling breaths of the child. Thorne, after a curt assessment of the situation and realizing the renegades posed a wider threat to the sparse settlements, had reluctantly agreed to make a wider sweep of the area before dealing with Bishop, leaving 2 of his men posted with a wary eye on the infirmary. Clara and Ben were thrown together in a desperate battle for Billy's life. They worked side by side, an unspoken truce between them. Ben, his own wound nearly forgotten, held the boy steady while Clara coaxed sips of willow bark tea between his parched lips. He kept the fire going, ensuring the cabin stayed warm against the biting night air. His large hands surprisingly deft as he wrung out cool cloths for Billy's forehead. Clara, drawing on every ounce of her experience, listened to Billy's congested chest, her face etched with worry, applying poultices and murmuring words of comfort. In those long, fraught hours, as they fought the fever that raged in the small boy, the last vestiges of suspicion between them seemed to burn away. They were no longer just a nurse and a deserter. They were 2 souls united in a common, urgent purpose, their movements synchronized, their quiet words of encouragement for the child and for each other, weaving a bond stronger than any spoken vow. They were, in that small, lamplit cabin, with danger lurking outside and a child's life in the balance, the closest thing to a family either of them had known in a very long time. The quest for self-worth, for both of them, was momentarily eclipsed by the desperate, selfless need to save another. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The fever in little Billy finally broke as a sliver of pearly dawn light pierced the grime-streaked window of the infirmary. A collective sigh, almost a prayer, escaped Clara and Ben. The child, though pale and exhausted, breathed easier, his small hand clutching Clara's finger. Outside, the 2 soldiers left by Captain Thorne stamped their feet against the biting cold of the early winter morning, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The sky remained a stubborn, unforgiving gray, the wind skirling dust and stray snowflakes around the huddled buildings of the settlement. Clara, her sensible brown wool dress smudged with soot and dried poultice, pushed a stray lock of graying brown hair back from her forehead. The scar on her cheekbone was a pale contrast to the weariness etched around her eyes that now held a grudging respect when they rested on Ben. He looked no better, his worn shirt torn at the shoulder, a dark stubble shadowing his jaw. But he'd been a rock, his quiet strength a bulwark against her own fears for the child. The fragile peace was shattered not by Thorne's return, but by a sudden volley of whoops and gunfire from the direction of the general store. Peterson, the homesteader, burst through the infirmary door, his face ashen. "They're here, the renegades, attacking the store." Miller's down, took a bullet to the leg. One of Thorne's troopers, a fresh-faced corporal, shouted from outside. "They're coming from the south end. Looks like a dozen of 'em." Clara's spine straightened. "Ben, help me with Peterson. Billy, you stay put, right there on that cot. You hear?" Her voice was calm, the practiced tone of a nurse taking charge amidst chaos, but her eyes darted to the window, her expression grim. The other trooper was already exchanging shots with figures darting between the sparse buildings. Ben met her gaze. In that instant, a silent understanding passed between them. This was it. "Get Miller on the table," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'll see to the door." As Clara and Peterson eased the groaning Miller onto her sturdy examination table, the sounds of battle intensified. Bullets thudded into the log walls of the infirmary. Ben, his face set in hard lines, grabbed the old Spencer rifle Jedediah had left behind weeks ago. He looked less like a hunted deserter and more like the seasoned sergeant he once was. "Clara," he said, his voice urgent, "stay down. Keep Billy down." He glanced at the 2 troopers outside, one already taking cover, returning fire, the other looking overwhelmed. He knew, with a soldier's grim certainty, that they wouldn't be enough. This wasn't a skirmish. It was a desperate raid by desperate men. He didn't wait for an answer. He flung open the door, not to flee, but to fight. "Jedediah, Peterson, if you can stand. We need to hold the line by the well. It gives us cover and a clear shot at the store." His voice, rough from disuse in command, now rang with authority. Old Jedediah, emerging from his cabin with a long rifle, gave a curt nod. Even Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, appeared in her doorway, a shotgun held steady. The few able-bodied settlers, fear warring with a fierce frontier grit, looked to Ben. The scene outside was chaotic. Dust and gun smoke filled the air. The renegades, a motley crew in tattered remnants of old uniforms and rough civilian garb, were pressing their attack, their faces contorted with a wild, hungry look. Ben directed the small group of defenders with swift, practiced commands, his military training snapping back into place. He felt a strange, bitter kind of freedom. He was done running. If he was to die, it would be on his feet, protecting the closest thing to a home he'd found in years. Then he saw him, a man with lank, greasy hair under a battered kepi, leading a charge towards the infirmary. Jake, Weasel, Summerfield, they'd served in the same company, shared hardtack and bitter coffee. Now, Weasel's eyes, small and cruel, met Ben's over the sights of their rifles. Bishop, Weasel snarled, a gold tooth glinting in his unpleasant grin. Always knew you were too lily-livered for the hard choices. Should have strung you up with the others back at that village. This ain't that village. Weasel, Ben yelled back, firing the Spencer. The bullet kicked up dirt at Weasel's feet. And these are decent folks. The confrontation was brutal. Personal, it was a battle not just for the settlement, but for Ben's own soul, a final stand against the darkness that had consumed men like Weasel. Inside the infirmary, Clara worked with focused intensity. Another settler, a young man named Tom, was dragged in, clutching a bleeding arm. As she bent over him, a bullet splintered the window frame above her head, showering her with wood fragments. She flinched but continued her work. Billy, terrified, began to cry. "It's all right, Billy. Stay down," Clara murmured, trying to soothe him while staunching Tom's bleeding. Another volley hit the cabin. One of the renegades, emboldened, made a dash for the door. Clara saw him out of the corner of her eye, saw the crazed look on his face as he raised his pistol towards Billy. Without a second thought, she threw herself over the boy. A searing pain shot through her left shoulder. She cried out, falling heavily. Billy sheltered beneath her. Ben, who had been maneuvering to cut off Weasel's advance, saw it all. A roar of fury tore from his throat. He charged across the exposed ground, firing the Spencer from his hip, driving the renegade back from the infirmary door. Bullets whined past him. He reached Clara in 3 strides, saw the blood blooming on her dress. "Clara!" His voice was raw with terror. He scooped her up, Billy clinging to her skirts, and carried them both to the relative safety of the back corner of the cabin, shielding them with his own body. "Are you hit bad?" "Shoulder," she gasped, pain making her dizzy. "Billy, is he?" "He's fine." "Clara, you saved him." Ben's eyes, fierce and tender, met hers for a moment. The battle raging outside ceased to exist. There was only the two of them, the scent of gunpowder and blood, and a bond forged in fire and fear. The tide began to turn. Ben's determined leadership, coupled with the stubborn courage of the settlers, was pushing the renegades back. They hadn't expected such organized resistance. Weasel, seeing his men falter and taking a bullet to his own leg from Jedediah's rifle, finally howled a retreat. The remaining outlaws scattered, melting back into the bleak landscape. Just as the last shots faded, Captain Thorne and his main patrol thundered back into the settlement. They took in the scene the retreating renegades, the wounded settlers, the bodies of 2 outlaws lying in the dusty street, and Ben Bishop, rifle still in hand, standing protectively near the infirmary door, his face grimed with smoke, his old Union coat torn and blood-stained. Thorne dismounted, his expression hard to read. He surveyed the damage, his gaze lingering on the wounded being tended by a pale but resolute Clara, who, despite her own injury, was already directing the care of others. He walked slowly towards Ben. The settlers watched, silent, expectant. "Bishop," Thorne said, his voice gravelly, "it seems you've been busy." Ben didn't flinch. "Just protecting my own." "Captain, same as you." Thorne looked at the faces of the townspeople. Peterson, Jedediah, Mrs. Henderson, young Tom. He saw not fear of Ben, but respect, gratitude. He saw the way Clara looked at Ben, a complex mixture of pain, exhaustion, and something akin to pride. He remembered the man Bishop had been. Before the war had broken something in him, or perhaps forged something stronger. The captain was silent for a long moment, the wind whistling through the bullet holes in the general store. Then, he made a decision. "My report will state that we pursued the renegades and engaged them here," he said, his voice carrying clearly. They were repelled with the assistance of the local citizenry. Several hostiles were neutralized. As for Sergeant Bishop, it appears he perished some time ago, lost in the territories. He met Ben's eyes. "There's no one by that name here." He turned on his heel. "Men, see to the wounded. We'll escort any who wish to leave to Fort Laramie when we ride out." A collective breath was released by the settlers. Clara, leaning against the doorframe for support, watched Ben. The tension slowly drained from his shoulders. He looked at his hands, then out at the wide, unforgiving land that had almost claimed him, and then, finally, at her. The way the community looked at them had changed. The whispers of "deserter" and "strange, scarred woman" were replaced by murmurs of "brave man" and "our Miss Barton." They had faced the fire together, and in doing so, had not only saved a small, forgotten settlement, but had perhaps begun to save themselves. The scars, visible and invisible, remained, but now they were not just symbols of pain, but testaments to survival and to the unexpected blossoming of courage and connection in the harshest of winters. The quest for self-worth had found its answer not in running from the past, but in facing the present, together in the raw, cold days that followed the renegade attack. The small settlement on the Dakota frontier breathed a collective sigh of fragile relief. Captain Thorne and his patrol had departed, taking the bodies of the fallen raiders and a few of the more seriously wounded settlers who wished for the more established care at Fort Laramie. His final, gruff words about Sergeant Bishop's supposed demise echoed in the clear, frosty air, a gift of anonymity that Ben accepted with the quiet gravity of a man given an unlooked-for reprieve. The townsfolk, their initial fear now replaced by a profound gratitude, no longer saw Ben Bishop as a deserter. They saw the man who had rallied them, whose quick thinking and steady nerve had saved their homes, their lives. In a makeshift town meeting held in the partially repaired general store, with the scent of splintered wood still heavy in the air, old Jedediah, his voice raspy but firm, proposed that Ben take on the role of settlement marshal, or at least an informal head of security. Man knows his way around a rifle, and he stood by us when it counted. Jedediah had declared, his gaze sweeping the room, challenging any dissent. None came. Ben, standing near the back, his arm in a sling from a shallow graze he'd barely acknowledged, felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the potbelly stove. He simply nodded, his throat too tight for words. Clara, her own shoulder bandaged beneath her mended calico dress, the fabric a practical, muted blue that complemented the silver threads now more noticeable in her neatly pinned-up brown hair, reopened her infirmary. The bullet hole in the wall was patched, the window reglazed with a precious pane brought by Peterson. But the most significant change was in the eyes of those who came to her. The suspicion was gone, replaced by open admiration and trust. Her scar, that silvered path from cheekbone to lip, was no longer a mark of otherness, but a testament to her courage, another wound earned in service. Much like the fresh one on her shoulder, little Billy, recovering swiftly, now shadowed her, a self-appointed, pint-sized assistant. Several weeks later, as the last stubborn fingers of winter began to loosen their grip, and the prairie winds carried the first faint scent of thaw, Ben approached Clara. He'd been quiet, observant, his days filled with patrolling the settlement's perimeter and helping repair the damage. In his calloused hands, he held a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its lines smooth, its tiny form captured in mid-flight. He'd whittled it during the long, quiet evenings, the shavings falling onto the rough-hewn floor of the small cabin he now occupied near the edge of town. "For you," he said. His voice a low burr. He held it out, almost shyly. Something to hold on to. Reminds me of, well, of things that can still take wing. I suppose. Clara took the bird, its polished wood warm against her palm. Her fingers traced its delicate shape. It was more than a gift. It was a symbol of hope, of resilience. A smile, genuine and unguarded, softened the lines of her face, making the scar seem less a mark of old pain and more a part of the landscape of her strength. It's beautiful, Ben, she whispered. From that day on, the little wooden bird lived in the pocket of her apron, a silent, constant reminder. Spring arrived not with a sudden burst, but with a slow, tenacious unfurling. The muddy, rutted tracks firmed up, and a pale green blush appeared on the distant hills. It was on a bustling market day, the first truly warm Saturday that felt like a promise, that Clara made a decision. For years, especially in new company, she'd unconsciously angled her head or used a strategically draped shawl to soften the impact of her scar. Today, she pinned her shawl firmly back. Taking a deep breath, she walked into the small, crowded square where settlers bartered goods and exchanged news. She held her head high, her gaze direct, meeting the eyes of her neighbors. Some looked, of course. A scar like hers was not easily ignored, but the curiosity was benign, even respectful. Mrs. Henderson gave her a warm smile and an extra measure of flour. Jedediah tipped his hat. The fear of judgment, a shadow she had lived with for so long, finally began to recede. Together, Clara and Ben became woven into the fabric of the slowly healing community. Clara's infirmary was a place of healing, not just for bodies, but often for spirits. Her quiet counsel and steady presence were as potent as her herbal remedies. She started holding informal lessons for the settlement's children in the afternoons, Billy proudly among them, their eager faces upturned as she taught them letters and sums. Ben, when not overseeing the mending of fences or organizing watches, found himself teaching the older boys how to track, how to read the land, skills vital for survival. He helped Peterson and others dig a new, deeper well, the rhythmic thud of pickaxes, a sound of shared labor and common purpose. They planted a communal garden, the dark earth yielding to their efforts, tiny seeds holding the promise of a future. One late afternoon, as a gentle summer sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of rose and amber, Clara stood on a small knoll overlooking the settlement. The air was warm, carrying the scent of prairie grass and wood smoke from cooking fires. Below, the cluster of cabins looked sturdier now, more permanent. Laughter drifted up from where children played near the newly dug well. She felt a hand slip into hers. Calloused and strong, Ben stood beside her, his gaze mirroring hers as he looked out over the small world they had helped to save, and were now helping to build. "It's peaceful," he said, his voice quiet, content. The lines of weariness on his face, though still present, were softer now. His hair, a little longer, was brushed back from a forehead no longer perpetually creased with worry. He wore a clean, mended shirt, the faded blue of his old uniform long since put away. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment, a comfortable, unhurried gesture. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." Her fingers tightened around his, the scar on her cheek, warmed by the setting sun, no longer ached with memory. It was still there, a part of her, a part of him now too, in a way, but it was just one thread in the richer, more complex tapestry of the life they were weaving together, a story of survival, of second chances, and of a place, finally, that they could both call home. The prairie stretched before them, vast and full of promise, much like the days ahead. Laxer, if this story stirred something in you, if you felt the cold, the silence, or the heat of a second chance? Drop a comment below and tell me what stayed with you. Would you have trusted him? Could you have forgiven yourself? And if you want more stories like this, tough hearts, quiet courage, and love that doesn't come easy, make sure to hit that subscribe button. The West still has more to say.